Hello, everyone. It's Pastor Jeremy for our Wednesday midweek devotion. This being my first midweek devotion coming from the parsonage. I had a Little League game yesterday and felt pretty good, and just later in the night started not feeling so good and basically have either food poisoning, not from Little League, but from something earlier in the day, or some kind of virus. And so anyways, it's kind of a downer just for my own sake because it's Wednesday and it's food pantry day, and our children are going to be participating in a mission project at the nursing home, and there's just been several things that I wanted to do today, and so there's never a good time to get sick, but I'm feeling especially disappointed personally tonight. But and I'm recording this pretty late on a Wednesday. I try to knock these out a little bit earlier in the week just because it frees up my Wednesday schedule some, but I'm not sure at this point if we'll show it in the traditional format that Brian works on, or if it'll just be something that I share. But either way, if you're watching this, we made it. And so tonight, we're going to be in our lectionary daily reading, which is Acts chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. And setting the stage for that, beginning of Acts chapter 1, we finished the Gospel of Matthew on Sunday. So in Acts chapter 1 now, we're seeing a different account of Jesus' last moments. But Jesus is with the disciples. He ascends up into heaven. They're looking for him, and there's an angel or something that's like, why are you looking for him? And he'll be returning. And then they have to figure out what to do next. How are they going to share this message? Their leader is gone. What lies ahead of them? And so we read that they go back to the places where they gathered. Said there's about 120 folks there estimated, and they just spent a lot of time in prayer. But I would imagine even during some of those prayer sessions, I don't know if you ever felt like sometimes you're in a prayer session and be like, okay, prayer is important, but like, what are we going to do next, right? I wonder if that was what was going on. But finally, we read here in Acts chapter 1 that Peter speaks. And so I'm going to read this. It says, in those days, Peter stood up among the believers, a group numbering about 120, and said, brothers and sisters, the scripture had to be fulfilled in which the Holy Spirit spoke long ago through David concerning Judas, who served as guide for those who arrested Jesus. He was one of our number and shared in our ministry. With the payment he received from his wickedness, Judas bought a field. There he fell headlong. His body burst open and all his intestines spilled out. Everyone in Jerusalem heard about this, so they called that field in their language Akeldama, that is, field of blood. For, said Peter, it is written in the book of Psalms, may his place be deserted, let there be no one to dwell in it. And may another take his place of leadership. The first couple times I read that this was the passage for today, I thought, what an unusual section of the story. There's so many things that we could cover, but in this particular one, I was kind of wondering, like, what do we do with something like this? But I just really started thinking about the tension in the moments about how to move on. And Peter had been through so much personally. Everybody had, but he had been through so much that we read about in some of the other Gospels. And so you have this question of like, what do we do when there's still obviously the implications of sin, conflict, deceit? They're all wondering, I wonder, what if Judas had not betrayed Jesus? Would that have saved Jesus' life? There was questions about who would fill in for leadership now that Judas was gone. There were just all these things that were happening. And we live in a culture because our pastors, myself included, our ministry leaders are all human, which means we all sin. And unfortunately, the sin of believers sometimes creates a lot of issues for unity and how we continue to move forward. And so I was just thinking about this passage and thinking about a few things that may have been going on and maybe some lessons we can use either if we have hurt someone or maybe someone has hurt us or we've been burned by the church. And the first thing was this, is that at some point you have to deal with the tension in seeing a brother or sister fall to a tragic end. The Judas question was not going to go away. And I'm not sure that Peter answered it and everybody's like, okay, and it was never a question anymore. But nevertheless, sometimes we are so afraid of conflict that when something happens, when sin happens, some people are way too eager to talk about it, and some people just kind of want to push it aside. But Peter knew that in that moment, they were not going to be able to move forward until they were able to talk about what had happened. Now, at no point did Peter say what Judas did was right. At no point was it a confirmation that of anything in particular. He just knew that this is someone who had been there with them. I would imagine that there was a lot of feelings of betrayal. We talk about Judas betraying Jesus, but I imagine some of the disciples were also feeling betrayed. Like, we have left everything to follow this man, and you turn him over for just a little bit of gold. But now, as they're trying to start this new vision of following Christ, somebody needed to talk about it. And so I just think it's healthy. The way we talk about it matters. You see that it was covered in prayer. You see that Peter spoke carefully, which was not always Peter's preferred method of speaking. And nevertheless, it needs to be addressed. And so I just think that churches, especially churches, need to be willing to own the consequences of sin and leadership failures, and to not try to build power structures where leaders are able to take control and they are never held accountable for what they've sinned in. So that's the first thing. But the second thing that stuck out of me in the story was, of course, the person who was sharing this message. It was Peter. We know in other gospel accounts that Peter himself had denied Jesus. He had 3 times, even though he swore that he wouldn't, he said, I would never, Lord, I would never do that. But when the time came, when he was being tested, when he was worried about his life, we see that Peter is the one who was denied Jesus. And he also knew the power of being restored, the conversations with Jesus, and Jesus welcoming him back into the story. I had a professor, I think it was a professor, who said one time, and he was probably quoting somebody else, but one of the saddest things about the story of Judas, because we see that Judas had a pretty big downfall even after betraying Jesus. One of the saddest things about Judas was that he didn't stick around to see how the story would end. Peter stuck around. He was able to be a part of this restoration because he, in the midst of his failures, didn't run away. But Judas had thought that he had done something so awful, so horrible, that he was no longer going to be able to be welcomed. And so Peter speaking with empathy was important in here, because there were probably many good things that Judas had done. The unfortunate consequences of his sin, and it was a doozy, right? Of betraying Jesus was going to be the thing that he is remembered by. But I've struggled with this one personally, because I don't know if you've been in this situation, but sometimes we have leaders, or for me it's a lot of Christian musicians or leaders that you kind of thought like, okay, these are the ones that we can trust. These are the ones that seem like they've got it all together. And then they do something and they get caught in sin. And I say caught in sin, we all sin, but I mean like we find like sexual sin, like abuse, like just things that are just not acceptable, right? And so you then have these questions of like, what does that mean for all the good that had happened? And so I don't have the complete answer to this, but I think that Peter does a good job of showing empathy for the situation, reminding them that yes, this is Judas who messed up, and this is Judas who betrayed Jesus, but this is also Judas who was one of us. And so we need to be able to hold that truth in as we go. And then the other thing that stood out to me in the story was this really grotesque stuff that they talk about where Judas died and how he died and what the field looked like and all that stuff. And I just think it's helpful for us to remember that when things happen like this, everyone is going to remember. That field would be remembered forever because of the sin of Judas and the curse that had fallen on it. But when we think that we have cleaned up an incident, sometimes we think people shouldn't talk about it anymore. But there will be people that will never darken the doors of a church again because they were so betrayed by a church leader and the church didn't handle it well. There will be people who want nothing to do with the gospel because they have been hurt. And so I'm not saying that they're right, but what I'm saying is it is just helpful to remember that from the very beginning as a church, we have been forced to deal with the implications of our leaders that have failed. And so that is a part of our story. I hope to never be caught, never commit, caught or commit both in any of those horrible sins. But like churches have a responsibility for not ignoring things that happen, showing respect for the good that had happened, because God is able to use all people. And so even those who we caught doing horrible things may have done some good. but then we also remember the baggage. And so maybe if you're approaching someone and they don't know about whether they want to come to church, or they're having a hard time coming back, or they have a story, a lot of times that's based on something that had happened that maybe you've made peace with, but they just have been able to use that against them. And so I see hope in this, because after this, and spoiler alert for the next a couple of readings, is they then will replace Judas. The last verse that I read actually said, may another take his place of leadership. Even in the midst of moral failures of leadership, even in the midst of horrible decisions and things that gone wrong, God's mission continues. And God is going to continue to work to restore the world through the presence of Jesus, through the power of the Holy Spirit. The church is going to continue. And so they didn't just say, well, we'll never find anybody good enough, or we're not going to do this, or this isn't how it's going to be. No, instead, what they decided to do was they decided to move forward. I was thinking about a couple weeks ago, Jenny and I had a chance to go to the Ryman Auditorium, which is just a lot of fun. It's my first time going to the Ryman in Nashville. And saw one of our favorite musicians. His name is Ben Rector. Actually saw Ben Rector in concert the week before we came here as a trial sermon. So we've seen him a few times, but at the Ryman was just a whole nother level. But anyways, Ben Rector on his last album has a song called Heroes. And I won't share the whole song, but in the song Heroes, he's basically... One of the reasons I enjoy Ben Rector is because he writes music to, I won't say my generation, but a lot of things we can relate to. We're about the same age. We have kids. He said in a podcast one time that he strikes to be just relatable with things that we all are going through. And so anyways, in the song Heroes, he's kind of talking about all of his old heroes that he had growing up that over time he realized maybe weren't so good, or maybe life was a lot harder than he realized. And so, he mentioned like when Ken Griffey Jr. was a giant, but then his parents got divorced, not Ken Griffey Jr.'s parents, but his parents got divorced, and the real world came crashing down on him. And so he's talking about, I miss my old heroes, and he's talking about the simplicity of living, but he says this particular line that made me think of this. He says, I miss my Bible study leader, had all the answers for living in the big bad world. Don't know if he still talks to Jesus, but his wife's remarried now, and I think he sells garage doors. As a former youth minister, I struggle with this sometimes of seeing students and wondering how did we relate to them at a certain time, and what have they seen from the church since then, whether it's things that I've done or that others have done. And I think this is true for many who want nothing to do with church right now, is that they have seen people who taught them to be certain and sure and morally 100% upright on all things. And I wish that was possible, but all those things are challenged. But instead, he now sees that this guy's life has changed so much. And so those people that we put on the pedestal had fallen. And that always resonated. So as I was thinking about this story, I was thinking of the disciples gathering, the 120 folks that were with them, and having to deal with the issue of Judas. They didn't just ignore it. They didn't demonize everything that they did, but then there's also a reminder that then in many ways the church would have to account with that failure for a very long time. And so not the most cheerful of Wednesday devotions, but I think it is a very much needed one, because we struggle sometimes to figure out what we do when folks seemingly fail. And so anyways, I hope that you're having a great week. We've had just a couple of really good weeks recently, aside from myself being sick today, just seeing lots of good things, lots of good energy. And we're starting to get into crunch time. I know many of you all are dealing with getting closer to graduation and into the semester, and we're already planning, talking about summer. And so boom, 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 we're kind of just going. But looking forward to my first summer in the Berg. We were moving all last year, and so we're kind of looking forward to just being here and celebrating and spending some time and seeing all there is. So I hope to visit with you soon. I hope you'll visit with us on Sunday. If you watch us online and it's the only way you're able, we honor that, and I'm just glad that you're here. If you are physically able to come, we would love to have you there. We are working to make online as good as it can be, and I hope that it is meaningful, but I also know that many of our folks who watch it online would much prefer to be in person if they were able. And so if you are able, I would encourage you to not ignore that opportunity that you have. And so anyways, take it easy. I hope that you all are well, and I will talk to you soon.